Langston Reed, a successful black heart surgeon in the small town of Millbrooke, faces systemic racism and corruption as he battles powerful figures, including a wealthy businessman and a prejudiced mayor, who seek to undermine his hospital and reputation. When a patient's suspicious death becomes a weapon to frame him, Langston must confront not just the lies aimed at destroying his career, but the deep-seated racial biases that view his success as a threat. As he fights back, Langston is forced to navigate a world where the truth is buried under layers of racial injustice and deceit. It was a Tuesday morning when Langston Reed walked into Tessa's cafe, just off the main strip in the heart of Millbrooke, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of a worn denim jacket that had seen better days. The jacket, faded but well cared for, clung to the image of a man who had built a multi-million-dollar heart surgery center but who rarely allowed himself to show it. Langston's polished dress shoes, a mark of his status, were now hidden beneath the soft soles of sneakers that had clearly seen a few miles of gravel. His suit, expertly tailored and perfectly cut to frame his athletic build, hung loosely over his shoulders, as if it were an afterthought rather than a statement. He was someone who preferred comfort over show, even in the presence of power. Tessa's cafe was an unassuming place. Its cracked tiled floor and booths with old vinyl upholstery spoke of a time before gentrification arrived in the town. A place where nothing much ever changed, and yet, it always felt like home. A place where locals sat with their coffee cups in hand and exchanged stories of the day, often at a volume too low for strangers to catch more than fragments. The morning sun cast a warm, golden light across the shop's wide windows, filling the room with an almost nostalgic glow, the kind that made Langston feel at peace amidst the bustle of his successful life. Behind the counter, Tessa was already wiping down the espresso machine, her black apron slightly askew. A thick smile appeared on her face when she saw Langston, a familiar customer, though she didn't recognize him as the heart surgeon who had transformed Millbrooke's struggling hospital into one of the best in the state. "Well, look who decided to show up," Tessa teased, though it was a joke as much as it was an invitation. Langston nodded, offering a quiet, almost apologetic smile. "Morning, Tessa," he said, his voice smooth but grounded. "Just the usual today." "Of course, Langston," she chuckled. "You're an easy man to please. Regular coffee, extra sugar, and don't think I don't notice the way you drink it slow like you're savoring every drop." Langston made a point of visiting the cafe every week, typically at the same time, always on the same day, not because he had a particular craving for the coffee, but because he liked the simplicity of it. The world could move in a rush around him, but in this place, he was just another face among the locals. Nobody cared if his name was on the building across town, or if his net worth could buy the entire street outside. In Tessa's cafe, he was Langston, the guy who had somehow slipped under the radar of those who expected him to flaunt every inch of his success. He pulled out a chair at the nearest booth and sat, glancing around as he settled in. The usual morning crowd was there. A retired couple whispering over their newspapers, a group of town elders gossiping about the upcoming town council meeting, and a couple of young mothers seated in the corner booth, chattering about school fundraisers. Everyone seemed to carry their own small piece of Millbrooke's pulse, a sense of slow comfort in the air that made the town feel both timeless and a little trapped in its ways. Langston wasn't a stranger here, but neither did he belong fully. Millbrooke was a town that had once been home to many black families, but had seen them gradually pushed out over the years. The old schoolyard rivalry still simmered in the streets, and Langston, despite his position as one of the most influential men in the state, found himself navigating a web of subtle prejudices that had been carefully woven into the fabric of this small town long before he arrived. Tessa set down the coffee in front of him, smiling knowingly, as she slid into the booth across from him. Without waiting for an invitation, Langston had often noticed the way the older generation seemed to watch him closely. Sometimes out of respect, sometimes out of curiosity, but always with an air of suspicion. He never minded it. He was used to it by now. "I hear things are going well at the center," Tessa said, stirring her own coffee absent-mindedly. "The mayor's been bragging about you at the meetings, says you're saving lives." Langston leaned back, exhaling as he looked out the window, his mind momentarily drifting to the hustle of the hospital. "It's been good, Tessa. We've helped a lot of people, but it's not just about the patients, you know. It's about creating opportunities. People are starting to see this place for what it really is." Tessa nodded, but kept her eyes trained on him. You know, it's hard for some people to look beyond the surface, she said softly, her tone shifting. They don't always see the bigger picture, especially when the picture's painted in shades of a different kind of power. Langston's eyes flicked to hers for a moment, and he could see the understanding, the careful awareness in her gaze. It wasn't just about his medical expertise or the hospital's success. There were people in this town who saw him as a threat, not for his skill, but for what he represented. A black man in power. A black man who wasn't supposed to be here, thriving where others had failed. There were those in Millbrooke, many of them in positions of power, who quietly resented Langston's success, and they would do anything to undermine him, whether through political maneuvering or silent backhanded tactics. The door to the cafe creaked open, and Langston's attention shifted as a tall man in a well-tailored suit walked in, a smile already stretched across his face as he looked around the room. The smile was directed at Langston, but it didn't reach his eyes. Langston knew that look. He'd seen it too many times before. It was the look of someone who was playing a game he had no intention of losing. The man made his way over to Langston's booth, his polished shoes clicking against the worn floor. "Langston Reed," he said, extending a hand that felt more like a formality than a greeting. "I'm Mark Grayson. I've heard quite a lot about you and your work." Langston shook his hand, keeping his expression neutral. "It's always nice to meet new people. How can I help you?" Grayson took a seat without asking, his smile never faltering, though his eyes were calculating. "Oh, I'm not here for help. Actually, I represent several investors interested in your work, Langston. We think Millbrooke has a lot of potential, and your little venture here is just the beginning. You've done quite well for yourself." Langston's grip tightened slightly around his coffee mug, but he kept his tone even. "I'm not in the business of selling off Millbrooke's future," he said softly. "The center is here to stay. I'm not interested in investors coming in to turn it into a corporate asset." Grayson's smile flickered, just for a moment. "Oh no, nothing like that. We're simply interested in finding ways to streamline operations, help you reach more people. I've got a few contacts, you see, very influential people. If we work together, well, I think you'll see that there's a lot more money to be made than just running a hospital." Langston's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth of the liquid, as he considered his next words carefully. Grayson wasn't offering partnership, he was offering leverage, a way to squeeze Langston out of his own success, replacing his ideals with cold corporate ambition. It was the same tactic they always used: make him the token black man in charge, let him think he's in control, then pull the rug out from under him when he least expected it. "I'm not interested in making money off people's pain," Langston said firmly, his voice carrying weight. Grayson leaned back, his smile faltering for a moment, but then it returned. More insistent, more manipulative. "I think you'll change your mind. The right price will always make things easier to handle, don't you think?" Langston's eyes narrowed, and for the first time in this small town, a deep sense of foreboding settled over him. This was just the beginning. The same power players who had tried to silence others like him for years were beginning to target him, his hospital, his reputation, and everything he'd worked for. "I think you're wrong, Mr. Grayson," Langston replied, his voice calm but firm. "And I don't think you'll be getting an answer from me anytime soon." Grayson didn't press further, but the air between them had shifted. The tension was thick, like a storm on the horizon, waiting to break. Langston watched as Grayson turned to leave, his presence lingering long after the door closed behind him. There was a storm coming, but Langston Reed was no stranger to adversity. He would face it, just as he always had, head on. The question was, would Millbrooke be ready for the change that was coming with it? With the weight of his responsibility pressing heavily on his chest, Langston took a final sip of his coffee, placed the empty cup down on the table, and walked out into the crisp morning air. Langston Reed stood at the edge of Millbrooke's main street, the morning light stretching long across the cracked sidewalks as he walked toward his car. His hand brushed the fabric of his worn denim jacket, the small comfort of its familiarity, a quiet contrast to the storm brewing in his chest. The encounter with Grayson had rattled him more than he cared to admit. In Millbrooke, the subtlest of threats didn't come from the obvious enemies. It came from those who wore a smile while working behind the scenes, making sure nothing changed, not even a little. They'd seen him, a black man, rise above what they'd imagined possible for someone like him. And it was clear now that the battle wasn't just about his work anymore. It was about the town accepting him as an equal, a notion that had always been more fragile than he'd allowed himself to realize. As he slid into the driver's seat of his sleek black car, a gift from his success that he often felt more self-conscious about than proud of, he couldn't shake the feeling that Grayson wasn't the only one out to challenge his place in Millbrooke. The whole town was built on stories that people liked to tell about the way things had always been. People like Langston, in their minds, didn't belong in positions of power. There was a framework that society had constructed, one that kept men like him in check, and for all the change Langston had brought to Millbrooke, it was clear that some people didn't want it. Langston drove through the center of town, his thoughts swirling as the car passed by the usual spots: the hardware store where old-timers sat outside in their folding chairs, exchanging gruff, barely friendly remarks; the bakery that never seemed to change; the scent of fresh bread, a silent welcome that rarely reached anyone beyond the door. And then, there it was, the Millbrooke Municipal Courthouse. It sat at the corner, its massive stone steps a familiar landmark of legal and social order, the towering columns standing as if to declare to the world that everything in this town ran by the same rules. But Langston knew better. Rules didn't apply to people like him, not in the way they applied to everyone else. As he parked and stepped out of the car, Langston noticed the officer at the entrance to the courthouse. Officer Daniels, his face hard and expressionless, was chatting with a group of locals, his hand resting casually on the holstered gun at his side. He was the kind of officer who always seemed to have something to prove, and Langston had seen him around more often lately, making rounds in the neighborhood where the hospital was located. He hadn't been a friend, exactly, but there had been a distant respect today. Langston wasn't so sure. "Morning, Officer Daniels," Langston greeted, nodding his head politely as he approached the courthouse steps. Daniels turned slowly, as if noticing Langston for the first time, and then his lips twitched into something that could almost be called a smile. "Morning, Mr. Reed," he said, but the lack of warmth was immediate. His eyes flicked up and down, lingering just a bit too long on Langston's black jacket and sneakers before meeting his gaze again. Langston maintained his calm. There was a time when he'd have let the tension slide, or ignored the way some people looked at him, but after everything he'd worked for, after every patient he had saved, every breakthrough in heart surgery that had made Millbrooke proud, it was becoming harder to ignore. "I didn't expect to see you here this morning," Officer Daniels continued, crossing his arms over his chest. His tone was thick with something unspoken. Langston paused, his face neutral. "I had a meeting with the city council," he said, letting his voice trail off. The fact that he hadn't seen Officer Daniels before didn't surprise him. The officer had been around often enough, in a quiet, almost predatory way, but their paths had never quite crossed, until now. "Oh, is that so?" Daniels drawled. "Well, I'm sure we'll be seeing more of each other. Millbrooke is full of changes, huh?" Langston's lips tightened. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a challenge veiled in politeness, and Langston knew exactly what he meant. Change wasn't something Officer Daniels, or a lot of people in Millbrooke, was ready for. "I'll be heading inside," Langston said, nodding politely, trying to dismiss the conversation as he walked toward the door. But Daniels didn't move, his eyes following Langston with a curiosity that bordered on discomfort. As Langston entered the courthouse, the weight of the officer's gaze still lingered. The courthouse's heavy doors closed behind him with a muted thud, and Langston exhaled slowly, letting his shoulders relax just a bit. It wasn't unusual to feel the weight of people's eyes on him, especially in a town like Millbrooke. But today, with Grayson's words still fresh in his mind, the scrutiny felt different, more deliberate, more hostile. Inside, the courthouse was quieter than usual. A handful of staff members moved quickly between offices, the soft echo of footsteps on marble floors filling the silence. Langston moved toward the elevator, his purpose clear. He had a meeting with the mayor to discuss the next steps for the hospital's expansion project. It was a matter of growth, of improving Millbrooke's future. But Langston was beginning to wonder just how much growth this town was truly ready for. When he stepped into the elevator, he was joined by a woman he recognized from the city council meetings, her makeup impeccably applied, and her posture stiff, the kind of person who knew the power her position gave her. She didn't look at him as they waited for the elevator to ascend, but Langston could feel her eyes on him in the reflection of the silver doors. "Mr. Reed," she said, finally breaking the silence, "I understand you're doing some good work over at the hospital." Her tone was distant, her words polite but calculated. Langston gave a short nod. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished so far." The woman didn't acknowledge his response. Instead, she glanced briefly at him, then down at her watch. "I hope you know that not everyone is as pleased with your influence here. People are starting to talk." Langston's brows furrowed slightly, the words pulling his attention sharply. "What kind of talk? You'll figure it out soon enough." The woman's lips curled into something that might have passed as a smile, but Langston didn't miss the edge of disdain in her eyes. "Power doesn't come without its share of trouble, Mr. Reed." The elevator dinged, and the woman stepped out without another word, her high heels clicking sharply on the floor as she made her way down the hallway. Langston stood there for a moment, the doors closing behind him. It wasn't the first time he had felt the weight of their prejudice, their subtle insinuations. He was the black man who had become too powerful, too successful, too visible, and the more visible he became, the more they would push back. By the time Langston entered the mayor's office, he was already mentally preparing for the conversation ahead. It was an open secret that Mayor Thompson had always been more aligned with the town's old guard than with the idea of genuine progress. Langston didn't expect an easy fight, and he certainly didn't expect any favors. "Langston, always a pleasure," Mayor Thompson greeted him, though there was a strained smile in his voice. "Let's get down to it, shall we?" Langston nodded, taking a seat across from the mayor. They exchanged pleasantries, but there was something disconcerting in the way Thompson's gaze darted over him, as if Langston were an intrusion rather than a partner in the city's growth. Thompson adjusted the papers on his desk, his movements deliberate. "I've been hearing some things about the hospital," he began, not looking up from the papers. "The way you're handling things, it's not the way we've always done it. The small-town way, you know?" Langston's pulse quickened slightly, but he kept his voice even. "The small-town way hasn't been working for years. I'm trying to change that. Bring jobs, better healthcare. It's good for Millbrooke." The mayor paused, his lips pressing into a thin line. "The people like things to stay simple, Langston. This growth you're talking about, it changes things, you understand?" "I'm not here to change everything," Langston replied, his voice steady, though the words felt heavier than they should have. "I'm just here to make things better." Thompson's gaze finally lifted, meeting Langston's directly. "I'm sure. But change, real change, it's never as simple as it seems." Langston felt the weight of the mayor's words, the subtle push against his authority. It was all starting to come together now. The little comments, the sideways glances, the whispered concerns from the city council. He wasn't just up against one man, he was up against the quiet resistance of an entire system that had long been in place, unwilling to accept someone like him in the role he was forging for himself. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats, and Langston felt that familiar ache in his chest, the frustration of knowing that he had to fight, not just for his own success, but for the future of Millbrooke itself. His gaze narrowed. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. "I'll make you a deal, Mayor Thompson," Langston said, his voice firm. "I'll make Millbrooke a place you're proud of, but you're going to have to get out of my way." Thompson chuckled softly, but Langston could see the flicker of something darker in his eyes. "We'll see about that, won't we?" The room felt colder suddenly, and Langston realized that the battle he'd been fighting for years had just escalated to a level he hadn't anticipated. Langston Reed's hand clenched around the steering wheel as he navigated the quiet streets of Millbrooke. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one crashing into the other. The mayor had made it clear, Millbrooke's growth wasn't the priority, it was about control. His hospital, the work he'd poured his heart into, was just another pawn in a much larger game. He could feel the town's old guard closing in on him, the subtle threats from Grayson, the cool disapproval from Officer Daniels, and now, Mayor Thompson's veiled resistance. This was no longer just about medicine. It wasn't about healing or saving lives. It was about power. Who held it, and who was meant to stay in the shadows? Langston had fought tooth and nail to rise above, to prove that someone like him could not only survive in a system rigged against him, but could thrive. Now, that success was being attacked in ways he hadn't anticipated. His car pulled into the hospital parking lot, and for a brief moment, Langston sat still, his eyes staring out at the brick and glass facade of his heart surgery center. The building had become a symbol for him, a testament to the change he'd fought for both his community and his own legacy. But as he took a deep breath and exited the car, something in the pit of his stomach told him that today, things were going to change forever. Inside, the hospital was bustling with the usual activity, nurses moving swiftly between rooms, doctors making rounds, and patients waiting for treatments. But there was an air of tension, a feeling of uncertainty that Langston couldn't shake. He hadn't been in the building long when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from Mitchell, the hospital's chief of staff, and one of the few people Langston trusted implicitly. "Langston, you need to get to the back office. There's been a situation. It's bad." The message was short and direct, but the urgency behind it was clear. Langston's mind immediately flashed to the worst-case scenarios. Had something happened to a patient? Was there a security breach? He quickly made his way through the halls, his thoughts racing faster than his feet could carry him. When Langston reached the back office, he was met with a sight that made his blood run cold. Mitchell was standing near the door, his face pale and drawn, and the entire room was filled with tension. A police officer, one Langston recognized as Officer Daniels, was standing by the desk, his posture stiff, arms crossed. His eyes flicked toward Langston, and there was a faint smirk on his lips, like he had been waiting for this moment. "Langston," Mitchell said quietly, his voice strained. "There's been an incident, one of your patients. He's the one who's been speaking out about you. He's been found dead, and now they're claiming it's connected to your hospital." Langston's heart skipped a beat. He felt the blood drain from his face as his mind struggled to make sense of what he was hearing. "What are you talking about?" Langston asked, his voice tight. "Who's been found dead and why are the police involved?" Daniels stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Langston's. "This man, Marcus Harris, he had a lot of things to say about your hospital, Langston. A lot of accusations you didn't know, but he was digging into your records, looking for things that didn't add up." Langston felt the weight of Daniels' words sink in. He could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just about a disgruntled patient, it was about an attack on everything he had built. Someone was trying to make an example of him. "Look," Langston said, his voice sharp as he fought to maintain control. "Marcus Harris was a good man, a father, a husband, he had every right to speak his mind. But this isn't what it seems. He was getting treatment, and we were working with him to find a solution." "Doesn't matter," Daniels interrupted coldly. "What matters is what people are going to think when the news breaks. They're already starting to say that the hospital's involved in something bigger, that you're covering things up." Langston's breath caught in his throat as the implication hit him. This was bigger than one patient. It was a coordinated smear campaign. They had chosen Marcus Harris as the sacrifice, and they weren't going to stop there. Langston knew exactly who was behind this: Grayson, the mayor, and whoever else had a vested interest in taking Langston down before he could disrupt their control over Millbrooke. "You're not going to get away with this," Langston said, his voice low and threatening. He took a step forward, his eyes locking with Daniels as he clenched his fists, fighting to keep his composure. "I've worked too damn hard for this. You'll need more than accusations to bring me down." Daniels didn't flinch. "That's not how this works, Reed. This isn't a fight you can win. You're in too deep. This town will never accept a man like you running the show." Langston's anger flared. Every word Daniels spoke was a reminder of the systemic racism and prejudice that had shaped Langston's life. His success had always been treated as an anomaly, as if it were a threat to the established order, and now the very people who had once praised his efforts were turning on him. The reality of his situation hit him like a freight train. He couldn't just fight this on his own. The walls had been built around him, and now they were closing in fast. Mitchell looked at Langston, his face filled with both concern and guilt. "Langston, I'm sorry, but we need to call the authorities. If we don't, things will only get worse. You know how these things go? Once they have a narrative, they won't let go." Langston turned to Mitchell, his mind racing. He could already hear the whispers, the rumors building in the air. They were going to frame him, and if he didn't act fast, they would succeed. There was only one way out, and Langston wasn't about to back down. He had built something that mattered, something real, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. "No," Langston said firmly, shaking his head. "I'm not going to let them control this. I'll make sure the truth comes out. They won't get away with this." He turned to Officer Daniels, his gaze cold. "You think you can scare me with this? You're wrong. I'm not backing down. You're going to regret underestimating me." Langston stormed out of the office, his mind already turning over the plan he needed to execute. He had the resources, the connections, and the people who could help him expose the corruption that was poisoning Millbrooke's heart. He wasn't about to let them destroy everything he'd worked for. As he left the building, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Officer Daniels' words echoed in his mind. "This town will never accept a man like you running the show." Langston had spent years proving people like Daniels wrong. But now, with everything on the line, the stakes had never been higher. In the distance, he could see Grayson's car parked outside, the man standing in front of it, his gaze sharp and calculating. It wasn't just about a smear campaign anymore. This was a full-scale assault on everything Langston had fought for. But Langston knew one thing. He wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. Langston Reed's heart pounded as he made his way through the hospital's back corridors. Each step was heavier than the last, and the flickering fluorescent lights above seemed to mock the turmoil inside him. The sense of urgency had only grown since he'd stormed out of his meeting with Officer Daniels and Mitchell. This wasn't just a simple smear campaign. This wasn't even about his hospital anymore. The strings that held Millbrooke's power structure together were unraveling, and Langston was right at the center of it. He had made a decision. The only way to save everything he'd worked for, to protect the future of his hospital, his patients, and his community, was to expose the corruption that had been festering in Millbrooke for years. He couldn't afford to play by the rules anymore. This town wasn't going to change unless he pushed back with everything he had. Langston pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Mitchell's number, knowing the man would be at his desk. It rang 3 times before Mitchell picked up, his voice low and shaky on the other end. "Langston, what's going on?" Mitchell's tone was full of worry. "I told you, we need to be careful. This situation with Marcus Harris—" "Mitchell, I don't have time for careful anymore." Langston cut him off, his voice firm. "I need you to pull every record we have on Harris. I don't care how long it takes. Get everything. Every piece of paperwork, every note, everything he touched. I need it now." There was a pause on the other end, the sound of papers rustling faintly through the line. "Langston, are you sure about this? If we go public? If we expose this? It's not just Harris anymore. You're talking about going after Grayson, the mayor, the entire system that's been running this town for years." "I know what I'm doing, Mitchell," Langston replied. His grip tightened around the phone. "I can't keep letting them control the narrative. We have the proof we've been quiet for too long, but now I'm going to expose them all. I need your help." "All right, I'm on it," Mitchell said reluctantly, the sound of resignation in his voice. "But Langston, this is dangerous. I'm not sure we're ready for the kind of fire this is going to bring." "I don't care how dangerous it is," Langston snapped, his voice a mix of frustration and resolve. "It's the only way to win now. Get the records and be quick about it." He ended the call and shoved the phone back into his pocket, taking a deep breath as he reached the main hallway. He knew Mitchell was right. It wasn't just about Marcus Harris anymore. This had escalated into something far more dangerous, but Langston had no choice. The quiet whispers of corruption that had been present in Millbrooke for decades were no longer going to be ignored. As he passed through the hospital's lobby, Langston's phone buzzed again. He glanced down at the screen and saw an incoming message from Sarah Kim, the hospital's head of administration, someone he trusted deeply. "Langston, you need to get to the city courthouse. I just heard there's going to be a press conference. The mayor is about to publicly accuse you of malpractice and cover-ups. This is bad." His stomach dropped. The timing couldn't have been worse. They were pushing their narrative hard, and they were going to use the press to turn the public against him, to frame him as a villain. It wasn't enough for them to destroy his reputation. They wanted to destroy everything he'd built. They wanted to make an example of him. Langston didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and made for the exit, his mind already racing with what he had to do next. He couldn't let this go unchecked. The press conference would be a trap, a setup to discredit him before he had a chance to strike back. He couldn't afford to stand by and let them control the story. He had to act. Now. By the time Langston arrived at the city courthouse, a small crowd had gathered in front of the entrance, their murmurs blending with the hum of traffic on the street. News vans lined the curb, their satellite dishes pointed toward the building, cameras set up for the press conference that was about to begin. The tension in the air was thick, and Langston could feel his pulse quicken. Every step he took toward the crowd felt like a step into an arena where the rules of the game no longer applied. He scanned the scene, looking for Sarah. She was standing off to the side, her face tense with worry as she glanced over her shoulder toward the courthouse entrance. Langston pushed through the crowd, making his way toward her. "Sarah," he called quietly, his voice low, urgent. She turned quickly, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Langston, you can't be here," she whispered, grabbing his arm and pulling him to the side. "They've been talking about you all morning. The mayor's going to tear you apart in front of the cameras. You're not ready for this." "I don't have a choice anymore," Langston replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "This ends today. I'm not running from this. I'm going to expose them all." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the decision in her mind. Then, she nodded. "All right, just be careful. You're walking into a storm." Langston didn't reply. He had already made up his mind. If they thought they could destroy him with lies and manipulation, they were gravely mistaken. He moved toward the doors, pushing through them with a calm confidence that was far from the anxiety he felt bubbling beneath the surface. Inside, the courthouse was eerily quiet, the echo of footsteps on marble floors almost deafening. He made his way to the press conference area, where a group of reporters had gathered in front of a podium, the mayor standing behind it, ready to make his statement. Grayson was standing off to the side, his face twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He noticed Langston immediately and gave a slight nod, almost like a challenge. The mayor cleared his throat and began speaking, his voice booming across the room as he addressed the media. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. We have gathered here to address some serious concerns regarding the operations of the Millbrooke Heart Center. We've received numerous complaints from patients, their families, and whistleblowers within the facility, alleging gross misconduct and malpractice." Langston's blood ran cold. They were starting the attack. The mayor was spinning the narrative, painting him as the villain before the public could hear his side. But Langston wasn't about to let it stand. He stepped forward, his presence cutting through the room like a force of nature. The reporters looked at him in confusion as he strode to the front, standing just a few feet away from the mayor's podium. The mayor's gaze flicked toward him, momentarily flustered, but Langston didn't wait for an invitation. "I'm here to correct a very dangerous and damaging lie," Langston said, his voice calm but steady. "The accusations against me, against this hospital, are baseless. There are people in this town, people with power, who are using their position to tear this community apart. They've been manipulating the truth for years, and now, they want to silence anyone who speaks out." The mayor's face flushed red as Langston continued, his voice rising with each word. "They want to take down this hospital because it stands for something they don't want Millbrooke to become. A place where everyone has a chance, no matter their background, where we can rebuild, grow, and heal. And I won't stand by while they destroy that. I won't let them." The reporters shifted, some pulling out their phones to record, others scribbling notes. The air in the room had shifted, and Langston knew he had their attention, but it wasn't enough. He had to give them something they couldn't ignore. "Grayson," Langston said, turning toward the man who had been the mastermind behind the smear campaign. "You've been using your influence to push your agenda for years. You and your friends in this town have been running Millbrooke like it's your personal empire, and it's time for it to stop." Grayson's smirk faltered, and for the first time, Langston saw a crack in his armor. The room was silent, the tension palpable as everyone waited for the next move. Langston's eyes locked on Grayson's, and he could feel the weight of the moment. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The moment he would either win or lose everything. "Enough!" the mayor shouted, slamming his fist on the podium. "This is a press conference, not a courtroom. You won't get away with this." Langston didn't flinch. He had already thrown down the gauntlet. The next move would come from them, but he was ready. He had nothing left to lose. The doors to the courthouse burst open, and in rushed a team of police officers, their presence causing an immediate stir. Langston felt the walls close in. The stakes were higher than ever now. The room fell into stunned silence, the press conference now a battlefield of accusations and counterclaims. Langston Reed stood at the front of the courthouse, his voice steady, but filled with conviction as he faced off with Mayor Thompson and Mark Grayson. The eyes of the media were all on him, and for the first time, Langston felt a wave of power surge through him. He had thrown the gauntlet down, and now the forces arrayed against him had to respond. Grayson's expression was a mask of controlled rage. His smile, that predatory, arrogant grin, was gone now. Instead, his face was twisted with barely contained fury. "You're making a mistake, Langston," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? A black man trying to change the system from the inside, but you're nothing but a pawn in a game you'll never win." Langston took a step forward, his posture unwavering. He could feel the eyes of the press, the crowd, the reporters, and he knew it was now or never. He had to take control of the narrative, to expose the truth, not just for his own sake, but for everyone in Millbrooke who had been silenced for too long. "You're the one who's making a mistake, Grayson," Langston said, his voice cutting through the tension. "You think you can control everything, this town, this hospital, people like me. But you've underestimated the people who actually matter. You've underestimated the truth." Grayson scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to Langston, the space between them charged with animosity. "The truth?" he mocked. "There's no truth in a place like this. There's no room for people like you to rise. You've been nothing but a token, Langston. A token who's allowed himself to be used. But when the truth comes out, when the people see who you really are, they'll turn on you, just like they turned on your mother. You won't win. You never could." Langston's heart tightened at the mention of his mother. He knew Grayson was trying to provoke him, but the words stung nonetheless. He had lost his mother years ago to a system that didn't care about people like her. He had lost her to the same prejudices and biases that had haunted him throughout his life. And now Grayson was using that against him. "I'm not my mother, Grayson," Langston said, his voice low but resolute. "I'm stronger than that, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else destroy the progress we've made. This hospital is mine, not yours. This town belongs to everyone, not just the people who look like you." The mayor stepped forward then, his face a picture of feigned concern. "Langston," he said, his voice oily with false sympathy, "you've got it all wrong. This is bigger than you. This is about the future of Millbrooke, about making sure that the right people are in charge. You're a good man, but you're not meant to lead. You can't change things by playing the game the way you've been doing. You've got to realize that some people just aren't fit to lead." Langston's eyes locked with the mayor's, and for a moment, everything else in the room seemed to fade away. "I've seen what happens when people like you get to decide who's fit to lead," he said, his voice a razor-sharp edge. "You've spent your whole life deciding who belongs in power, who deserves respect. Well, I'm done with it. The system you've built isn't just broken, it's corrupt, and I'm not afraid to expose it." A moment of silence passed between them. A deep, charged stillness. Langston could feel the weight of the situation pressing on his chest. He had no idea what would happen next. If they would turn the media on him, if the authorities would drag him out of here. But he knew one thing. He couldn't back down. And then it happened. The tension in the room suddenly cracked. Officer Daniels, who had been standing quietly near the back of the room, stepped forward, his face cold and detached. "Langston Reed," he said, his voice flat. "You're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Harris. We have evidence tying you to his death." The words hit Langston like a blow to the chest. His mind spun, and for a split second, he couldn't comprehend what Daniels was saying. "What? This is a lie!" Langston shouted, his voice filled with disbelief and rage. Daniels didn't flinch. "The evidence is clear. Reed. You thought you could hide the truth, but we know what you've been up to. You can't escape the law. You're going to pay for what you've done." Langston's eyes darted to the press, to the cameras that were now capturing every word, every gesture. He knew what was happening. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a public execution of his character. They were trying to destroy him in front of everyone, to frame him as a criminal, a murderer. "No," Langston said, his voice rising with determination. "This is what you've been waiting for, isn't it, Daniels? You want to see me fall. You want to see me torn down because you're afraid of what happens when someone like me takes control of a town like this." Daniels took another step forward, the smirk never leaving his face. "You can keep denying it all you want, Reed. But the truth is, your time is up." Langston's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with anger and frustration. He had worked so hard, fought against the very system that now sought to destroy him. And yet, here it was, his entire world being dismantled in front of him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't let them see him break. He couldn't let them win. "I won't let you do this," Langston said, his voice cold and controlled. "I'm not the one who's guilty. You're the ones who've been hiding the truth. You're the ones who've been lying to the people of Millbrooke." The room was in chaos now. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the tension in the air was unbearable. Langston could feel the walls closing in on him. He knew he didn't have much time. He had to act, and fast. In that moment, a voice cut through the madness. "He's right." Langston's head whipped around, his heart leaping in his chest as he saw who had spoken. Mitchell stood at the back of the room, holding up a stack of papers, his face resolute. "I've been working with Langston for years," Mitchell said, his voice loud and clear. "And I've got the proof, the real evidence, the records Marcus Harris was digging into, records that point straight to Grayson and the mayor. This whole thing has been orchestrated from the start. Langston had nothing to do with Harris's death. But these men," he gestured to the mayor and Grayson, "they've been covering up their corruption for years. They've been running Millbrooke like a dictatorship." The room fell silent, the weight of Mitchell's words hanging heavy in the air. Grayson's face contorted with fury, and the mayor's eyes flickered with panic. They hadn't anticipated this. They hadn't expected someone from within Langston's own circle to turn on them. "You've got it all wrong, Mitchell," Grayson hissed, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You're too late." Langston took a step toward Mitchell, his eyes never leaving the antagonists. "No," he said, his voice unwavering. "It's not too late. The truth is out now. You can't silence it anymore." But even as Langston spoke, a chill ran through him. He knew this wasn't the end. They had tried to destroy him with lies, and now they were going to come after Mitchell. They would fight back with everything they had, and Langston couldn't predict what would happen next. As the police moved in, the uncertainty hung thick in the air. Was this the moment they would break him? Or would he be able to finally expose the truth? The tension crackled, and Langston knew that the fight was far from over. This was just the beginning. Langston Reed stood in the middle of the courthouse, the walls around him closing in. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He had spent years building something meaningful in Millbrooke, a legacy of progress, equality, and hope. Now, everything he had worked for was teetering on the brink of collapse, driven by lies and systemic corruption. Grayson and the mayor had tried to tear him down, using Marcus Harris's death as a weapon to frame him. They thought they could break him, that they could manipulate the truth until it suited their agenda. But Langston wasn't going to let them win. Not now. Not after everything. The room buzzed with the sound of cameras clicking and reporters shouting questions. Langston could feel the eyes of the media on him, waiting for his next move. He had to be decisive. If he faltered, everything he had built would crumble under the weight of their lies. He could already feel the tension in the room, like an electric current running through the air. It was time to stand firm, to make his move. "Langston," Grayson sneered, stepping forward with a look of cold disdain. "You've really gone and done it now. Do you have any idea what you've just unleashed? You think you can play this game and win? But you're in over your head. I've built this town. Everything here runs because I allow it. And you?" He chuckled darkly. "You're a child playing at something bigger than you can ever understand." Langston clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the weight of Grayson's words. But beneath the sting, a fire burned within him. This wasn't about power or control, it was about justice. And Grayson, the mayor, and the others who were complicit in this system had underestimated Langston's resolve. "I'm not your pawn, Grayson," Langston said, his voice calm, but filled with an unwavering strength. "I'm not your plaything to manipulate you, and the mayor think you can control Millbrooke, but I'm not backing down. You've been hiding behind your money and your power, but it's time for the truth to come out." Grayson's eyes narrowed. "You're an arrogant fool, if you think anyone cares about your so-called truth. You're a black man who's gotten too big for his britches. You really think the people of this town will stand with you over the people who've been in charge for decades?" Langston's gaze never wavered. "I don't need the approval of men like you, Grayson. I don't need your validation. The truth is bigger than you, it's bigger than any of us, and it's time for Millbrooke to face the reality of what's been happening in the shadows. The people in this town deserve better than what you've been selling them." The mayor, who had been standing quietly off to the side, stepped forward with a sneer on his face. "You're talking about justice, Langston. You think you've been fighting for justice? No. You've been fighting for power. You've been fighting for a place in a system that was never meant for you. The truth is, Langston, you've been a tool all along. You've let yourself be used by people who were only ever interested in their own gain." Langston's breath caught in his throat at the accusation. He knew the mayor and Grayson were trying to turn the tables, to paint him as the villain in this story. But Langston refused to let their words poison the truth. He stood taller, his chest expanding with determination. He wouldn't let them rewrite his story. "You're wrong," Langston said, his voice unwavering. "You think I've been used? No. I've been building something, I've been giving people hope, and now you're trying to destroy that, to tear it down because you're afraid of what happens when the truth finally sees the light of day." Grayson let out a mocking laugh. "Hope? You think you've given people hope? All you've done is fooled them into thinking you're something special. You think your hospital is a beacon of change. It's just another cog in a machine that's been running this town for years. You've been playing your part, Langston, just like the rest of us." Langston's hands balled into fists, and he stepped closer to Grayson, the space between them charged with tension. "You don't get to talk to me like that. Not anymore. You've been running this town, like it's your own personal fiefdom, using people's lives to line your pockets, and I'm done watching. The people of Millbrooke deserve better than men like you. They deserve the truth." Grayson's eyes flashed with anger. "You think you can take me down, Langston? You think you have the power to destroy everything I've worked for? You're nothing but a naive fool who doesn't understand the stakes. You've stepped into something you can't handle. You've crossed a line you can't come back from." Langston's resolve hardened. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let Grayson or the mayor tear it all down with lies. He had the truth on his side, and he wasn't about to back down now. "You want to talk about lines?" Langston said, his voice calm but fierce. "The line you've crossed is one of corruption. You've been manipulating this town for years, keeping people down, using your power to silence anyone who tries to speak the truth. But I'm done being silent. The truth is coming out, whether you like it or not." The room was silent, every eye on Langston as he stood before Grayson and the mayor, unyielding in his stance. It felt like the entire town was watching, waiting to see how this confrontation would end. And then, as if on cue, the doors to the courthouse swung open and Officer Daniels stepped inside, flanked by 2 other officers. The tension in the room ratcheted up as the officers moved toward Langston, their presence a silent threat. "Langston Reed," Daniels said, his voice cold and detached. "You're under arrest for the murder of Marcus Harris. We have enough evidence to charge you. It's over." Langston's heart raced, but he refused to show fear. This was the moment they had been trying to break him, to frame him for something he didn't do. But Langston wasn't going down without a fight. "No," Langston said, his voice sharp. "This isn't over. This is just the beginning. You're trying to pin a crime on me that I didn't commit. You're trying to destroy everything I've worked for because you're afraid of the truth. You want me to go quietly, but I'm not going to let you get away with this." Daniels didn't flinch. "You don't have a choice, Reed. The law is the law. You're going to pay for what you've done." But before Langston could respond, Mitchell, who had been standing near the back of the room, stepped forward, holding a stack of documents in his hands. "Langston's right," Mitchell said, his voice steady. "You're the ones who've been covering up the truth, you and Grayson. I've got the evidence right here." The room went still as Mitchell began laying out the papers. The sound of rustling documents filled the silence. "These records, these are the ones Marcus Harris was investigating. They point directly to Grayson and the mayor. They've been manipulating the system, covering up their corruption, while people like Langston have been doing the real work. Grayson's face twisted in fury, his eyes narrowing. This is a joke. You think these papers will save you? You think this will change anything? Mitchell stepped forward, undeterred. The people will know the truth. It's not too late to make this right, but it will be if you keep hiding behind lies. Langston's eyes met Mitchell's, a silent understanding passing between them. He knew what they were about to do wasn't going to be easy. They were exposing a system that had been in place for decades, and the backlash would be intense. But Langston had made his decision. He wasn't going to let the mayor or Grayson get away with this. Officer Daniel's hand hovered near his holstered gun, his eyes flicking between Langston and Mitchell. "Enough of this," he said. "You're coming with us, Reed." Langston's chest tightened, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to back down now, not when the truth was finally within reach. "You think you can silence me?" Langston asked, his voice growing louder, more powerful. "You think you can intimidate me into submission? This isn't just about me. This is about everyone in this town who's been oppressed by people like you. You're not going to get away with this." The tension in the room reached a boiling point as the officers stepped closer, their eyes filled with cold determination. Langston knew the stakes had never been higher. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. One wrong move, and everything he had worked for could be ripped away, but he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The courthouse was in chaos, the energy of the room still crackling from the dramatic showdown that had just unfolded. Langston stood at the center of it, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his hands clenched at his sides as he faced the aftermath of the confrontation. The once confident Grayson now stood in shock, his face pale, his smugness replaced by a look of disbelief as the weight of what was happening began to sink in. Langston could feel the eyes of the media on him, every camera trained on his every move, but he didn't flinch. For the first time in a long while, Langston felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. A sense of control. It was strange, almost surreal. For so long, he had been trying to fit into a system that had never truly accepted him. But now, standing in the middle of the storm he had fought so hard to avoid, Langston knew he was in the right. The truth was finally out, and there was no turning back. Mitchell, who had been by his side through it all, stepped forward, holding up the stack of papers that had exposed Grayson and the mayor's corruption. "These are the records," Mitchell said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "These are the papers Marcus Harris was investigating before he died. They detail Grayson's ties to illegal activities, shady land deals, and money laundering. And here, these documents show the mayor's involvement in silencing anyone who tried to speak out." Langston looked at the crowd of reporters, their phones now recording, their eyes wide with shock. It wasn't just the revelation of the corruption that was significant, it was the fact that, for the first time, people were seeing the truth, not the carefully crafted narrative Grayson and the mayor had spent years building. The silence Langston had fought against was finally being broken. Grayson's face twisted in anger, his composure slipping. "This is a setup," he spat, stepping forward, his hand trembling as it clenched into a fist. "You're all being manipulated. This is just a distraction." Langston took a step forward, his gaze steady. "No, Grayson, the distraction was everything you've done to cover up the truth for years. You think you can keep manipulating this town with lies, but the people deserve better than that. I'm done letting you control the narrative. It's over." Before Grayson could respond, the doors to the courtroom opened, and several police officers, including Detective Maria Torres, stepped in, flanking a team of detectives who were here on official business. The air in the room thickened with anticipation as Langston's words echoed through the space. "These officers will make sure you're held accountable for everything," Langston said, his voice unwavering. "It's over." Grayson tried to make a run for it, his eyes darting toward the exits, but the officers were quick to act, blocking his path. For the first time, Grayson looked like a man who realized his empire of lies was crumbling. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice raw with panic. "You don't know who I am. You can't bring me down." But Grayson's threats fell on deaf ears. The mayor, too, had been arrested, his face drawn with defeat as the officers moved in to take him into custody. The reporters, who had been on edge just moments before, now swarmed around the scene, capturing every detail. The truth, it seemed, had finally become undeniable. Langston watched as Grayson was escorted out of the courthouse, his head hung low, his once confident demeanor shattered. He couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph, a sense that justice was finally being served. But as the weight of the moment settled on him, Langston knew that this was just the beginning. As the officers left with Grayson and the mayor, Langston turned to Mitchell, his voice low. "This isn't over. There's still a lot of work to do." Mitchell nodded. "I know. But this is a good start, Langston. You've done something incredible today. You've shown people that it's possible to fight back, that truth matters." Langston looked at the crowd of reporters, their cameras still trained on him. The story was already spreading across the town, but there was something bittersweet about the moment. The victory was hard-earned, but it came at a great cost. He had fought so hard to be accepted, to prove that someone like him, someone from a community like his, could rise above the system. But today, he'd learned that the fight didn't end once you reached the top. It was a continuous struggle. "We've made a difference today," Langston said, his voice steady. "But there's still more to be done. We need to keep fighting for the people who've been left behind, for the people who didn't have a voice. This isn't just about me anymore." As the press conference came to a close, Langston stepped outside, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just transpired. The sun was beginning to set over Millbrooke, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps. Langston stood for a moment, letting the silence of the moment settle in. The battle had been long, but today, the truth had won. Langston's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from Sarah Kim, the hospital's head administrator. "Langston, we've got your back. We're not letting them destroy the hospital. We'll keep fighting. This is just the beginning." Langston smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The people who had stood by him, Mitchell, Sarah, and the entire hospital staff, had shown him that he wasn't alone in this fight. He couldn't do it all on his own, but with the right people by his side, there was hope. As Langston walked away from the courthouse, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The town had been shaken by the revelations, and there would be backlash, there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long while, Langston felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The struggle was far from over, but he was no longer fighting in the shadows. The truth was out, and he was going to keep fighting for justice. Over the following weeks, the momentum Langston had sparked began to grow. The media coverage of Grayson and the mayor's corruption spread like wildfire, and the people of Millbrooke, once too afraid to speak out, found their voices. Protests were held outside the courthouse, demanding accountability. Community leaders, inspired by Langston's courage, rallied together to push for reforms in local government. It wasn't easy, and the opposition was fierce, but Langston knew that the town had been changed forever. The groundwork had been laid, and now the people had a chance to take back control. Langston's hospital, once seen as an outsider in the community, became a symbol of hope, a place where people could trust that they would be treated with respect, dignity, and care, no matter their background. But Langston knew it was more than just about healthcare. It was about showing people that they could change the system, that they could take control of their own futures. He wasn't just a doctor, he was a catalyst for change. One afternoon, several months after the arrests of Grayson and the mayor, Langston sat on the steps of his hospital, looking out over the town. The streets were busier now, the hum of activity different from before. There was a new energy in the air, a sense that things could, and would, be different. Sarah Kim sat beside him, her gaze thoughtful as she watched the people in the streets. "It's incredible, isn't it?" she said quietly. "How much has changed in such a short time?" Langston nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "It's not perfect," he said. "But it's a start. People are waking up to the truth. They're realizing that they don't have to live in fear of a system that's been rigged against them." Sarah smiled, a sense of quiet pride in her eyes. "You've done more than anyone could have imagined, Langston. You've given them hope, and you've given them a voice." Langston sat back, his mind drifting to the road ahead. There was still so much to do, so many battles to fight. But for the first time in his life, Langston felt like he wasn't just a bystander, he was part of something bigger. He had ignited a spark in Millbrooke, and now it was up to the people to carry that fire forward. Langston's phone buzzed again, and he pulled it out to see a message from Mitchell. "We've got the first meeting with the new council members tomorrow. It's time to start rebuilding. Let's do this." Langston smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he could see the path forward. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for the future of Millbrooke. And with every step, the vision of what this town could become was beginning to take shape. As Langston stood up, he felt the weight of everything he had accomplished, and everything he still needed to do. But there was no fear. There was only determination. He wasn't done yet.